Good morning, folks. I want to get started. My name is Rob Eyler, and I want to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development for having me here today and for Chabon Concepts for teaming up with me on this. We're going to talk about Sierra County today, but we're also going to talk about the economy in general and where we've been going, or where we've been and where we've been going potentially, and ultimately some of the things you should be watching for in the economy as we move forward. One thing I want you to do is I want you to use the chat function here in Zoom if you have a question, and we'll answer questions at the end of my presentation. So let's get started. The agenda for the next 30 minutes or so is for me to talk about the number of cases and sort of the movement we've been going on. And if you've been watching the president talk and been watching all kinds of the press conferences that have been happening, we're getting seemingly closer to the top of the hill. But because we've been socially distancing ourselves, that top of the hill, it might take a little longer to get to than we expected. And the economy and the number of jobs that are being lost are all somewhat dependent upon us getting the cases to peak and go on the other side, and then ultimately for us to get the economy turned back on. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. I'll talk about what's going on in California and some of the jobs and industries that are probably most at risk, and then we're going to start seeing some pretty wild numbers in April and May in terms of the loss of employment and the number of people that are on unemployment now. I'll talk then about Sierra County specifically and what we can be watching in terms of jobs and housing markets. And then ultimately at the end, I'll tell you about what indicators to watch in terms of going forward and things you can start thinking about with respect to economic development in Sierra County. So this is the case tracking as of the end of last week. And you can see we started to climb up on March 1, and that set off some issues in our economy, which I'll get back to in a minute. And this is what happened the 7 days before Saturday last week, or not Saturday, sorry, before Sunday this week. The point is that we've seen it start to flatten out. We need to get to the top of the hill, folks. We need to get on the other side for our economy to open back up again in earnest and actually support moving forward. The reason why we have not opened up yet is because, and I'll get back to this in a minute, the costs still exceed the benefits. And so it's very simple economics as to why we haven't opened, but it seems painful day by day by day. Well, where some pain really hit us was in our equity markets right after those cases started to ascend. And you can see on the far right-hand side of this graph that the S&P 500 dove very quickly in 1 month of almost a vertical dive down in terms of just looked like it was never going to stop. But it did stop the last week of March and ended up about 2584, coming down from 3277. So that is a pretty good percentage change. It's quite a bit of a chunk out of your portfolio, just around 20%. But notice that in the last two recessions, we've seen the same movement, but it took longer to get there. And we bottomed out at 735 after the Great Recession in the S&P, and we've had this amazing bull market ever since. So one of the things that we've been watching is that there have been some equity market reclamation movement, at least in terms of people buying again. And the market feels like right now that they are assuming that the policy measures we've taken, which I'll explain more in a minute, are going to support the economy once we open the economy back up. And those ripple effects will go all the way down to residents. And that gives investors more confidence. And that's why April has actually been a pretty good month on the market, given that March was so tough. One of the pieces of data that investors are watching and economists are watching and we're kind of all watching is the number of people that go into the unemployment office and ask for unemployment insurance. So economists call this new initial claims for unemployment insurance. And what I'm going to show you now are the quarterly averages of these from 1986 forward for the US and for California, because to look at 1 month or 1 week of these weekly claims is going to give you a lot of movement episodically, and you can't really believe those sometimes, even though we know we're climbing to some point. And I'll get back to some potentially kind of mixed good news in a minute. We want to look at it in sort of a rolling average. So a lot of economists look at a 12-week or a quarterly average, and this is actually the number of workers that have gone in and got unemployment. Here's the last 3 recessions that are inside of the 1986 to 2020 timeframe. And you can see the recessions relatively easily in terms of the peaks of these initial claims where people are losing their job, going in and get unemployment. And then that stops as the economy starts to rehire folks after a certain amount of time. And you can see that it climbs for a while, sometimes within the recession period that's shaded, sometimes outside of it where it peaks. But you can see on the far right-hand side for the US, it spiked hard northward the last few weeks. And so we're expecting a little bit more climbing for right now. But the good news is that there are forecasters out there saying that we may be getting close to the top of the hill in terms of the initial climb, and that we will see it somewhat flatten out and start to come back down. That is good news for forecasts going forward toward the end of the year and early next year, assuming that that pattern holds. We haven't quite seen it yet in the data, but they're starting to feel like that given the policy measures and the nature of how many people have gone in for unemployment insurance, that we're probably getting close to the peak, which is good. And I'll show you why in a minute, specifically for Sierra County. Here's California. You can see a little bit more seasonality in California, same sort of peaking either just after the recession is over, inside of it, and then the hard vertical climb over the last few weeks. So as I alluded to, we're sort of in the middle of three policy measures. On the positive side, monetary and fiscal policy, where interest rates have fallen and we've seen large packages come out of Congress, are both there to support consumers and businesses getting through this crisis cleanly and ultimately turning the corner and getting back toward what I'll show you later as a so-called baseline forecast. Unfortunately, the negative side on the social policy still outweighs these policy movements because we haven't been able to engage these other positive policies yet, as our economy has not quite started to move yet. On the one side, as I'll talk about in a minute, fiscal policy, we have received some checks at home. We have businesses who have received loans from SBA that are maybe going to turn into basically huge tax refunds because they're going to go from loans to grants. But all that and the so-called multiplier effects of those policies have not yet been able to start because we haven't started our economy back up again in earnest. So the social policy still outweighs the other two policies, but we're assuming that those are going to get bigger once the social policy fades. I alluded to the idea that a lot of counties and cities and states are looking at the costs and benefits of reopening. And I've been asked a lot about what are really the trade-offs if we start to reopen early, because if my place or my county or city has relatively few cases, why am I not reopening? And Sierra County, as a place that's relatively rural, may be thinking exactly the same thing. It's like, hey, we're not Sacramento, we're not San Francisco, what are we doing here? Well, the reason why you haven't reopened yet, and the state is very nervous about any place in California putting their hands up and saying, hey, we're opening up in full, is that we don't want to get reinfection. We've spent this entire time sheltering in place to try to minimize the healthcare system effects. And what we don't want to do is open too early and exacerbate that potential problem. We don't also want to have, in the medium term, that those reinfections lead to another shutdown. The worst thing that can happen short of a reinfection coming back after we go into the fall and winter, which I'll talk about in a minute, is to have a bad choice lead to reinfections in this current cycle and have to shut down again. That'll lead to a lot of problems in our economy because in the long term, what we don't want to do is we don't want to exacerbate the cost of doing business any longer, and we don't want to have any more structural change than necessary. We know businesses are going to go out of business. We know people are going to lose their jobs for a certain amount of time. If we get at it too quickly and we have a reinfection, we are going to end up exacerbating the problems we're trying to avoid. And that's exactly what's happening in the governor's office right now, is they're weighing the pros and cons of opening early or just opening at all with respect to these. Now, the benefit side, of course, is that we can get things cranking. So under the supposition that you're not going to have much of a reinfection or any reinfection at all, those jobs and spending that are right now kind of stagnant can get started again if you opened up, and the tax revenue can start flowing to your local municipalities again. And in the medium term, assuming that either A, we don't have a repeat of the virus coming back and infections at the same level, though there's a lot of science running around and a lot of people making a lot of money talking in front of people about what they think is going to happen. There's a lot of prognostication, a lot of it relatively well science-based, and we think that we are still under risk of having a reinfection in the fall or the winter. Now, the trick is that if we have a vaccine, which also there's a lot of debate about whether that's going to come in time, that also is a bet that businesses may be making to gain access to the benefits, in the sense that, hey, if this is the end and we're not going to have a repeat, there's a lot of good medium-term benefits in getting open. And then finally, in the long term, and this is the cool thing, no matter what we do, if we do everything right, the benefits of getting reopened correctly means that we might be able to see some adaptation and innovation and actually see businesses come out of this that are helping us mitigate the costs and make it more efficient for us to reopen and stay open if we do have reinfection. And that is critical. If we can have that kind of entrepreneurship kick in, that's going to help everybody. And folks, what we're trying to do ultimately is trying to avoid a long depth or a deep depth and a long duration of the issue, meaning these are the two biggest issues we're always facing as we go into recession. And the one thing that's been so weird about this case is that it hasn't been this slow-moving monster like the Great Recession was, where we sort of saw the hit, we started to tumble, the other side of the economy, the real side, jobs and income started to get hit, and we all fell down the hill together. But that took 12 or 16 months. This time, this is all happening in about 8 weeks' time. So the depth of this crisis is going to seem very deep, mainly because of the speed at which this thing is hitting us. And what we're now trying to avoid is it going too deep and also not lasting too long. So those are the two key aspects of what policy is trying to do, is avoid depth and duration. Let's look at unemployment rates briefly, because there's going to be a lot of focus on jobs numbers when they start coming out in April. On the jobs number side, the unemployment rate in the US is likely to start rising very quickly, as in California. This is what it's looked like since 1976, and there's now 5 recessions, where the last 3 recessions really should be the focus of your vision on these slides. You can see the unemployment rates usually peak after the recession is declared over, which the shaded area ends and the red line keeps moving up to a certain point and then dropping. You can see the California movement, and this is why I said to look at the last 3 recessions rather than all 5, is that the last 3 recessions, in contrast, the US and California unemployment rates have a much larger gap in the Gulf War I recession in 1991, and in the Great Recession, which is the last recession, in 2008 through 10. Now you can see that we came back very quickly in terms of getting people hired again, but we still never closed that gap between California and the US. And what that can tell you is that California tends to be a place, because of the dynamic businesses we have and also the amount of tourism we have here, that when we see cutbacks, we tend to cut back harder in California than the US, and the US tends to recover more quickly than California. But when California gets going, we really become a driver of the economy. So we will see how that goes. And you can also see at the very far right-hand side, some of the data has come out about the US that have seen a little bit of a kick up in March. And that's also true for California. It's going to be in April and May where we really see these unemployment rates spike based on the unemployment claims data I showed you earlier. Now, let's combine those data and look directly at Sierra County's recent history. The blue line, which takes on the left-hand axis, are the actual number of claims that you see in Sierra County since 2002 on a monthly basis. And then the unemployment rate in Sierra County, as reported by California EDD, but deseasonalized, is shown by the darker line. And you can see that the blue line in the Great Recession peaked, and it got to a certain peak and then peaked again and then really started to fall. So there was about 9 months between those 2 peaks, which suggests that if we want to watch something that's very specific to Sierra County, watch the new unemployment insurance claims as a way to gauge when we might see the peak of unemployment. But you have to expect that even though Sierra County is relatively rural, it may not have that many cases, it is going to be affected by the entire state economy contracting and with jobs being lost. And we already know that's happening because the numbers have come out and suggested that there's really no county immune to what's going on. It's more relative movements than the fact that there's some place that's some, sort of island of employment and not losing jobs. Okay, so now that we know that we're going to start losing jobs, where are the most vulnerable industries that we can think about when we think about economic development and where we want to focus our energies? Well, we've had some businesses that have remained open and have been relatively close to their customers, and we think that those businesses are quote unquote okay. Well, if you ask your local grocer, they may say, well, we've been doing okay, but the problem is that we're worried about what happens when the shelter in place is lifted. Is that going to shift demand in such a way that people are going to now go bananas and go buy everything but groceries? And then we just feel that reverberative effect after this is over rather than now. And the other retailers that have stayed open and other businesses is like, let's say, construction. There's been some good things happening under the surface that continue to move forward that may not be visible because you're not leaving your home. But if construction is continued, that's one solid part of our economy that we have not lost. In some places, it hasn't continued. And that's why each county is going to be a little bit different. But certainly, those essential businesses have been helped somewhat rather than shut down completely. One of the biggest places that we're going to be watching very closely is in travel. So mainly locally, you're going to have retail, hotels, and restaurants that are related to visitors that are going to be hurt the most. And you may say, well, look, the airlines don't affect me. But assume that there are tourists that come to Sierra County that fly into Sacramento, fly into San Francisco and drive and access airports. And if those folks don't come, then you're going to have to rely on a more domestic and maybe regional audience to try to fill in what you originally expected to be revenues and tax revenues from visitors in this summer period. And that's something to watch going forward, is how long does it take for the tourism or visitor industries to react in a way to new gathering stipulations, other social restrictions on people traveling, such that we don't have that many losses going forward once we open the economy back up. The travel industry was first in and is probably going to be one of the last out. Healthcare is one where there's been more of a mixed bag. We know acute care has gone up, but we also know, because the number of cases have not been as high as we first expected, acute care has not seen the gains that are somewhat dubious, but the gains nonetheless that we expected. So now you're hearing counties and their public health officers talking very slowly about, well, maybe we should open up our hospitals back for elective surgeries because the staffing is there. And if they don't have hospital beds occupied otherwise, why not take on that business and help people out when you can, rather than having them shelter at home waiting for those elective surgeries? That might actually spark other outpatient businesses to remain open if they're not already open as essential businesses. I know some are regionally here and there in California, but healthcare's had more of a mixed bag of effects and may have some trouble, especially in rural California. If you haven't been able to keep your hospital operating normally, you might see medical professionals think twice about remaining in the area because they just haven't had the revenue to continue to stay. Government's going to go through some machinations as well. Certainly with tax revenues going down or going to be projected to go down. For example, the state of California has now moved their budget deliberations to August because they just don't know enough to get the May revise done. We should expect there's going to be some leave taken, furloughs potentially, and a real strange mix of effects on the labor side of government. And why that's important is because if we expect government services demand to rise, we want workers there to deliver those services. Furthermore, if revenues continue to sag, that might mean that as people retire and take advantage of the current situation in terms of their retirement eligibility and not want to go through whatever furloughs and other changes in pay might exist, and they can lock their retirement benefits sooner than later, we may see some changes there where government will not necessarily rehire due to budget shortfalls. So we're watching government's reaction to this also very closely, and there's some vulnerability there. Finally, our low-wage workers, folks that don't make that much money. One of the things that you'll see is that unemployment insurance might bring actually more benefits to folks than they're actually making right now, which might make rehiring tricky, but it might also support lower wage workers on the front end. What we don't want to do is we don't want to lose those low wage opportunities once the unemployment insurance window fades and the economy starts to pick back up again. And also the amount of benefits may or may not still solve housing or hunger issues for those that are kind of what you could say the working poor. So from a policy standpoint, we're thinking about those things too. Now let's look at two potential forecasts of jobs as we start to wrap up and start looking at Sierra County a little bit more directly. The tricky scenario I'm going to show you is one in which we have a shortish recession because we've taken on similar measures to China and other places around the world where we really tell people we're going to shut everything down for a while, get through the infections, and then slowly open back up. If we can get, in a sense, a more V-shaped recovery, where it's sort of a modified V, where the right-hand leg is sort of angled out a little bit more than a normal V, that's going to be great, but we need to get the economy back open to do that, or the tricky scenario, which is relatively short-term in duration, is going to lead to an uglier scenario. And the uglier scenario is that we've generalized the situation, which actually has somewhat happened, and we've seen job losses rise. The trick in all this, folks, is the following. Think of the logic. We need to go from job losses, which we know are going to happen because of a reduction in demand, to making sure our businesses stay open long enough to where they can turn the corner and not exacerbate job losses and potentially rehire those that lost a job. If we have a domino effect from job loss to business loss, we'll have another round of job losses that will add to the duration and depth of the episode. And those are the two things, as I said earlier, we're trying to avoid. So if the restart is slow and industries cannot emerge well, especially in the tourism area, which utilizes the summer months as a way of really driving revenues, that might lead to a lost year of revenues, which is going to make it very tricky. And then we're going to be worried about what we can actually have in demand in 2021 and 2022 with so many people who have lost their job and remain on unemployment or remain without a job. Here's the graphics of that. This is a baseline scenario from the Department of Finance looking forward to 2023. And the idea here is that in January 2020, we looked forward to 2023 and said, hey, we're actually looking at a slow moving but positively moving economy. Well, there's the tricky scenario, and you can see the deep dive, and I'm going to hopefully show you my cursor here. You can see the deep dive here, and then this movement back up, a sort of a modified V, where this leg of the V has flattened out a little bit versus a more direct shape V, which you're being told by some of your politicians might happen, but is looking less and less likely every day. And that we basically start recovering or get back to where we were sometime in 2021, and then are back on the good foot here in 2022. In the ugly scenario, it's a little bit weirder, and there's a double hit because we might get reinfection. So if you go down sharply, we kind of open up a little bit, start moving back the way we want it to go, but then we have a reinfection problem. We might hit another problem in 2021, which will stretch this out through at least 2023. Now notice, these are scenarios, and they are, in a sense, educated guesses given the data we have. We might end up in the middle of the two scenarios, and we may end up just a little bit better than the tricky. But the dynamics of economies and recoveries tend to look like this. So here's the Great Recession in contrast, looking at the last two recessions, but really focusing on the Great Recession. Notice how slowly the hill came and we fell down in terms of the total number of workers that lost jobs. And then we had this great growth movement after we got out of the Great Recession in California and started to move up toward last year. Well, if you think about it, if we have that ugly scenario, we're going to be back at 2015 employment levels when we hit the bottom. And that's basically means we'll have lost 5 years of employment growth within about 1 year. And that's going to feel a lot like the Great Recession did. And that's why we're sort of hedging a little bit as economists, saying, well, what's this going to look like historically speaking? It's probably going to look like the Great Recession in the front end, but hopefully not in the back end in terms of duration. Here are scenarios for Sierra County, and I actually included what I originally was calling the good scenario here to give you a contrast of what might happen. This is more of the V-shaped recovery, but then following the California situation, here are those tricky and ugly scenarios. But notice, because of Sierra's rural location, if we have reinfection in California in the fall, in the winter, Sierra County may not be as affected by that on the front end, but it may be affected next summer by that because Californians will not be moving around anymore if they have lost their jobs again and or there's been an exacerbation of what's happening this year. But Sierra County has, because of its rural situation, some buffer potentially against the ugly, ugly scenario of having the double dip. Still, it's going to take some time because Sierra County, like other counties in California, regardless of the location, tend to follow the California lead on average. And then we're back to square around 2023. So there's the recessions, and that gives you some perspective. Thinking about what to do now, and this is critical. We know that there's going to be a shadow cast of this episode once we open back up. In other words, we should not expect everybody to go gangbusters once we open the doors. But tourism and downtowns are going to be focal areas given we're going into the summer season. So if you're an economic development professional or you're involved in downtown business affairs, think that those folks, those merchants, that especially the locally owned ones, are going to need help now and then into the summer probably just to stay alive. And that's critical if you want to keep either the quaintness of your downtowns or just the idea that you don't want to give up local ownership of businesses. Think triage there first. The other piece is on construction. And this is somewhat more about a municipal issue in the sense that if there's a lot of consternation about housing permits or commercial construction because people don't want growth, what you're going to find is construction is going to contract and look for where the best return on investment may be. If your county has become more costly or more of a quagmire to get projects through, this is the time to really think about, okay, let's look at the projects that have asked to be built and where do we want to prioritize to make sure that we have construction flowing on the other side of this if it's been an uphill climb to get some projects through. That's where your municipalities, your businesses, and your residents can all come together and partner in such a way to really drive better outcomes in terms of triage on the other side of this and get the economy started well. Construction is a great industry to reinvigorate your local economy. One of the issues in this, though, because Sierra County, like a lot of rural counties in California, do depend in the summer on the flow of tourism. What is the exposure of retail and restaurants in terms of taxable sales with respect to the total taxable sales for the local area? Well, that's Sierra County from 2009 forward on a quarterly basis. And you can see it's somewhat episodic. I did not take the seasonality out of this because it shows you how up and down the movement is, but it's really about the movement in the trend. So you can see it's been slowly rising in terms of dependence on retail and restaurants as a percentage of total taxable sales. But California generally has been relatively flat. And that's because, for states, generally you have a certain number of retailers and restaurants, and while some may come and go, there's really not an expansion of the total capacity over time, which means the total taxable sales that come from those are relatively stable regardless of what's going on in the economy otherwise. But you can see on the latter side of this, and I'll hopefully show you my cursor again, on the latter side of this, Sierra County's seen some uphill climb where it's slightly more risk exposed here recently than California on average, even though the decade previously it was less exposed. It's basically on average about the same as the state over the last couple of years. Now, what that means is that, again, like I told you before, the triage should come in places where there's the most exposure to losing those sales and trying to find ways in supporting tourism and your downtowns. On the housing side, a lot of people are probably worried about having a repeat in the housing market. This is the last little bit here in terms of real estate growth. 1 year ago, or from 1 year ago, we saw Sierra County's housing prices go up by about 0.8%. From 2 years ago, it's gone up about 5.3, and since 2010, it's gone up about 46.5%, or since the bottom. So we bottomed out in 2010, seen about half of that, or 50%, I should say, growth from the bottom. California's done a little better, though the last 2 years, it's been about the same as Sierra County. But the one thing we're very concerned about as residents who, if you own your home, is will this episode actually lead to a downturn in home values? And that's still a very open question. Part of it is based on new construction and not increasing the supply side too quickly, but a lot of it right now depends on demand. Will we see demand come in if existing units start to go up because people lose their jobs and they don't feel like they can stay in their home? Will demand be there to pick up that slack? Hopefully we're not going to test that hypothesis too deeply, but it's something that we're worried about in housing markets across the state. On the municipal side, just to wrap up, we know taxable sales are going to fall, so we're going to watch that very closely, including TOT. So if a city or the city or the county depends on the flow of visitors, cities are going to be worried very, very deeply about having the loss of TOT and the taxable sales. County's going to be worried about the taxable sales. Will construction slow down? There's a lot of permits and fees in construction projects, and will the county see some revenue issues there? If housing prices fall down, there's going to be a residential demand to lower the tax basis as a result of that, just like in the Great Recession, but that's a shock for the local municipalities as well. We know cost of providing social assistance is going to rise. We know people are going to demand more from government. So we're watching the revenue side and the cost side. And as I said earlier, those unfunded liabilities that CalPERS and our other pension systems have been waiting on might become funded suddenly, or have become actual liabilities, I should say, because people choose to retire now rather than delay. We'll see how that all works, but there are a lot of local government concerns. And so why that's important for business is that business and government really need to partner to come out of this well. And on the municipal side, on the government side, it's going to be a very tricky entryway back into normal life once we get started. So to wrap up, some short-term indicators of change. I talked about unemployment insurance claims, and we are following this. And in fact, the data just came out yesterday that now we're about 26.5 million people have asked for unemployment in the US. We're at approximately 2.8 million, or somewhere just a little bit over 10% of that in California. And that means unemployment is going to spike in April. So we're probably going to see numbers that are ugly, are things you've never seen before in your whole life, because if you're under 80 years old, we have not seen numbers like this for since before that time. Prepare yourself for those numbers, but also prepare yourself for the idea that policy has come in to quickly mitigate the continuation of that number being high. So watch for that coming through once we get the economy back and moving again. We're looking at job openings, the actual number of people that are employed in what industry. So we will see hiring on the other side of this, and we're already seeing hiring, especially in places that are essential businesses. So it isn't like there is not hiring, but whether hiring is enough to pick up that slack once the economy opens again, it's certainly not going to be for the next couple of months. But in July, August, September, that's when we'll really know the duration of the episode, as well as average hours worked. If people are reducing their hours worked but still working, that helps reignite the economy more quickly, because it's easier to turn on hours than to hire somebody back or brand new. The summer is going to dictate a lot to the local economy. So for Sierra County, one of the things to be very cautious of is, if you have a chance now to plan, I said this before, and it's hard for me not to emphasize this any more strongly, please think about how to support tourism in downtown now rather than wait. We're all waiting for the cases to peak, and that's still going to dictate policy in the short term. So watch for that. That duration and depth, or depth and duration, is however you want to say it, is really the key. We don't want to go too deep. We don't want to go too long. We got to mitigate both. And then finally, policy right now, while we've heard a lot of stuff in the news about what the Federal Reserve and Congress has done, until that policy subsides on the social side, nothing's going to change. So folks, again, I want to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development for having me today. And I think it's now time for questions. Vicki, if you're there, and there's been some questions in the chat box, please let me know.
Okay, there are. First question is, how will policy try to solve the mismatch between the relief package targeting 8 weeks of relief and your suggestion that the shelter in place will extend well beyond the 8 weeks?
That's a great question. So one of the parts of this is that the policy is really meant to provide a projected bridge over troubled water. And so when Congress decided to provide the relief, the 8-week period was seen as the hopeful time to reopen the economy. This has been one of the biggest frictions about what's going to happen with the next tranche of money. Is there going to have to be yet another one? So we're at about $3 trillion in spending right now. The hope is we're open in the next 4 weeks in sort of a rolling window opening, and that businesses get back to square to actually help them out sooner than later. But it is very much an open question whether or not there's going to be enough relief in what the current policies, its affectation on the actual economy is going to be considered for years to come.
Okay, thank you. Are economists concerned at all about a potential for municipal bankruptcies?
They are. And so one of the lessons we learned in the Great Recession is that there are going to be some vulnerable cities and counties. And certainly the state of California knows that there are vulnerable cities and counties, and they're going to have those probably on a watch, if you will, the next couple of weeks, or I shouldn't say the next couple of weeks, but the next couple of months once we reopen, with the idea that as we creep into finalizing the state budget, do we know enough about counties and cities to know where the fissures might show up in their budgets to provide some direct relief? So there's been a huge amount of money that is going to the public sector from Congress. I don't know if the state of California will do an analysis to where they say, okay, we think that these cities and counties need the money more than these cities and counties because we don't want any municipal bankruptcies to rear their head. I don't know if that analysis is actually going to take place, but the state of California and Congress are both very aware that there are going to be some risk of municipal bankruptcies, just like we had in the Great Recession on the other side of this, if it is too deep for too long. That's critical. But there's still going to be a little bit of risk out there for counties and cities that were already on the edge.
Okay, thank you. Could you kind of compare and contrast perhaps the length or the time that we can expect consumer confidence to return versus the previous recession?
That's a great question. Consumer confidence is extremely fickle. So, you know, it's something that if you watch the data, you have to be very cautious of watching quick movements in it, because you might have one month where a lot of bad is happening and consumer confidence sags. And then as soon as good news happens, consumer confidence spikes. And that's exactly what you should expect. The first couple of months after we open the economy, the consumers are going to be very confident when they answer the surveys. What is tricky to know is if there's reinfection, if there'll be a nosedive of that confidence on the other side, which will lead businesses to making decisions about, well, that confidence is fading again, so I don't think I want to make this investment or hire as many people back. So the consumer confidence thing, it drives a lot of outcomes, but in cases where there's already a lot of volatility and uncertainty, it can be extremely fickle and also extremely volatile. So it might be what you're going to see is a quick spike up of consumer confidence because people are going to be happy to get out of their houses. And then depending on how things go over the next, let's say 5-6 months, we might see as we go into the fall and winter that the confidence is going to fade unless a vaccine shows up. The vaccine is probably the number one way of sustaining consumer confidence over the next 18 to 24 months. But without it, it's still going to remain relatively volatile.
Okay, thank you. I do have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
How did you incorporate continued long-term social distancing impact on the 3-year recovery, i.e. the restaurants running at half capacity?
The social distancing and having this sort of lower capacity in some industries is part of the forecast in elongating the ugly scenario. In the tricky scenario, the supposition is that we will have that on the front end and there's a little bit of a slow movement to start, but then we will adapt and innovate in such a way to start mitigating those costs, or see, unfortunately, and this is why economics is sometimes called the dismal science, we'll see a loss of restaurants who cannot conform to those new conditions, and the ones that can will come into the fold or will absorb some of that slack. And that's where we're really concerned, again, about our downtowns, especially in rural California, because we don't have a lot of big box chains, let's say, nationally owned restaurant locations. A lot of those restaurants are still relatively locally owned. So we're concerned that there's going to be a quick marginal decision by the local ownership to say, okay, I'm done here. And that can leave a hole in rural California that a larger restaurant chain will not want to come in because the demand's just not there to support it. And the local person who's run it, or the local family that's run it, losing that touch is also losing some of the charm of our rural downtowns in areas.
Okay, thank you. All right, those are the questions that we've had posted. If you, after the fact, have additional questions, you feel free to contact Dr. Eyler at the addresses there on the screen. You can also contact AFWD or myself, Vicki, at Chabin Concepts, and we will get your questions answered. Thank you again for your time this morning, and good luck and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.